In the early hours of March 1st, 1942, the waters of the Java Sea finally fell silent. The battle was over. The flames that had consumed the Dutch cruiser De Ruyter had sputtered into the darkness, taking Rear Admiral Karel Doorman and 345 of his men to the bottom. The light cruiser Java had been blown apart so violently that 512 sailors died before they could even comprehend what had killed them. The Allied fleet that was supposed to stop the Japanese advance through the Dutch East Indies, this hastily assembled collection of American, British, Dutch, and Australian warships, had been annihilated in a matter of hours. The Battle of the Java Sea was the largest surface naval engagement since Jutland in 1916, and it ended in catastrophe. Now, with dawn approaching over Surabaya Harbor, the surviving Allied vessels faced an impossible choice. To the north, east, and west, Japanese warships prowled every strait and channel. Overhead, Japanese aircraft owned the sky, and somewhere beyond the horizon, a vast invasion fleet was steaming toward Java with 100,000 troops. The Dutch East Indies, the world's fourth largest oil-producing region, home to 45 million people, was about to fall. Among the chaos of Surabaya Harbor, where desperate captains calculated fuel loads and debated escape routes, lay a small steel minesweeper that history would soon remember for one of the most audacious escapes of the Second World War. Her name was Abraham Crijnssen, and her commanding officer was about to attempt something that his fellow captains considered suicidal. The Abraham Crijnssen was not built for moments like this. Launched in 1936 at the Gusto shipyard in Schiedam, she was a modest vessel, 525 tons of steel stretching 184 feet from bow to stern. Her two triple-expansion steam engines could push her to 15 knots under ideal conditions, though she tended to pitch and roll heavily in rough seas. She carried a single 3-inch gun and a pair of Oerlikon cannons. Her primary mission was sweeping mines from shipping lanes, important work certainly, but not the stuff of naval legend. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Anthonie van Miert, was a career naval officer who had graduated from the Dutch Naval Academy at Willemsoord in 1929. He had served multiple tours in the East Indies and had commanded the Abraham Crijnssen since October of 1941. Van Miert was methodical, cautious by nature, and deeply aware that his small ship and her 45-man crew were insignificant pieces on a board where battleships and aircraft carriers were being swept away like pawns. But Van Miert was also watching and thinking and planning. The situation deteriorated with terrifying speed. On February 27th, the Allied fleet had sailed out to intercept the Japanese invasion convoy and had been systematically destroyed. The heavy cruiser Exeter limped back to Surabaya with her boilers smashed. The destroyers Kortenaer and Electro were gone. The flagship De Ruyter and the Java were burning on the seafloor. Then came the Battle of Sunda Strait. The cruisers Houston and Perth, having survived the main battle, attempted to escape through the Sunda Strait on the night of February 28th. In the darkness, they stumbled directly into the Japanese Western Invasion Force, 56 transports screened by 4 heavy cruisers and 11 destroyers. In a furious hours-long battle, both Allied cruisers expended every shell they carried. The Perth went down at 12:25 in the morning. The Houston followed 20 minutes later. Both captains died on their bridges. Of their combined crews, more than 1,000 men would perish. In Surabaya Harbor, the word spread through the remaining vessels like a cold wind. The escape routes were closing, the Japanese destroyer screens were tightening, and Dutch headquarters had issued the final order. Ships that could not escape were to be scuttled. Under no circumstances would any vessel fall into enemy hands. It was in this atmosphere of despair that Van Miert called his crew together and told them what he intended to do. The Abraham Crijnssen belonged to the 2nd Minesweeper Division, which consisted of 4 identical vessels, the Jan van Amstel, the Pieter de Bieter, the Eland Dubois, and the Abraham Crijnssen herself. These 4 ships had received evacuation orders coded KPPX as early as February 17th, but the chaos of battle had prevented any coordinated escape attempt. Now, with Japanese forces closing in from every direction, the crews of these small minesweepers faced a grim calculation. The Pieter de Bieter never tried to run. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Decker, concluded that escape was impossible and ordered his ship scuttled on March 2nd. He would spend the next 3 years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. The Elan Dubois was in worse shape. Her boilers were defective, she lacked sufficient fuel for the journey to Australia, and desertions had left her critically undermanned. The Jan van Amstel had been damaged in a Japanese air raid on March 3rd, an attack that killed 23 of her crew. That left the Abraham Crijnssen, and Lieutenant Commander Van Miert had an idea that his fellow captains thought was madness. The Java Van Miert knew contained more than 18,000 islands. Many were substantial landmasses with towns and harbors, but many more were tiny, mere specks of rock and coral topped with a few palm trees and a tangle of jungle vegetation. From the air, these islands were indistinguishable from one another. A Japanese pilot flying at altitude over this vast archipelago would see nothing but an endless scattered mosaic of green and blue. What if, Van Miert reasoned, his ship became one of those islands? The concept was almost absurd in its simplicity. The Abraham Crijnssen was 184 feet long and roughly 500 tons of steel and machinery. The idea of disguising her as a tropical island seemed like something from a children's story. But Van Miert understood something that desperation often teaches. Conventional thinking had already failed. The conventional tactics, the massed fleet actions, the destroyer screens, the coordinated attacks had resulted in catastrophic defeat. Every Allied captain who had tried to escape through the Japanese patrols by steaming at full speed and hoping for the best had been hunted down and destroyed. Perhaps the answer lay not in outrunning the enemy, but in hiding in plain sight. Van Miert began preparations even before he received the final escape order. He had his crew rig camouflage netting over the superstructure. He requisitioned paint, grays and greens, and modeled patterns that would break up the ship's angular profile. And then he issued an order that would test every man aboard. The captain called an all-hands meeting and explained his plan. He intended to sail the Abraham Crijnssen through 1,000 miles of Japanese-controlled waters, moving only at night and hiding among the islands by day. The journey would take more than a week. Discovery would mean certain death, and he was giving every man aboard a choice. Anyone who wished to leave could disembark immediately. There would be no shame, no consequences. The men who stayed would be volunteers, fully aware of the risks. About half the crew chose to leave. All of the indigenous Indonesian personnel stepped off the ship. When the meeting ended, approximately 20 to 25 Dutch sailors remained, volunteers who had decided to stake their lives on their captain's desperate gamble. On the evening of March 6th, the Abraham Crijnssen cast off from Surabaya and slipped into the darkness. The first phase of the escape required the crew to transform their ship. They sailed east through the Madura Strait, then anchored near the small island of Gili Genteng as dawn approached on March 7th. Here, the real work began. The men went ashore with axes and machetes. They cut down entire trees. They hacked through tangles of jungle vines and tropical undergrowth. They stripped branches heavy with broad green leaves. Load after load came back to the ship in the small boats, and the crew set about the painstaking work of turning a steel warship into a floating jungle. The entire deck disappeared beneath a canopy of vegetation. Trees were lashed to the superstructure. Branches were woven through the railings. The bridge, with its distinctive angular shape, was buried under layers of foliage until it became an unrecognizable mound of green. The mast, which might otherwise betray the ship's true nature, received the same treatment, but vegetation alone would not complete the disguise. The hull of the Abraham Crijnssen was gray steel, and no amount of palm fronds could hide it if a Japanese pilot looked closely. So Van Miert's crew painted the entire waterline in patterns of gray and mottled brown, carefully mimicking the appearance of natural rock formations. Seen from the air, the ship would appear to be a small jungle island rising from a base of coral and stone. The transformation took hours of exhausting labor, but by the time darkness fell on March 7th, the Abraham Crijnssen had ceased to exist. In her place floated something that looked, from any reasonable distance, like one more tiny island among the 18,000 already dotting the Java Sea. That night, the disguised minesweeper raised steam and began her journey toward Australia. The escape plan was brutally simple in concept, but agonizing in execution. Each night after darkness fell, the Abraham Crijnssen would raise anchor, fire her boilers, and steam toward freedom at 12 knots. The crew navigated by the stars and by careful dead reckoning, threading through channels and straits, always aware that Japanese patrols could appear at any moment. Then, as the eastern sky began to lighten, they would seek out a new hiding place, a cove, a cluster of islands, anywhere the camouflage ship could anchor and blend into the landscape. And there they would wait, motionless and silent, while the sun crossed the sky and Japanese aircraft droned overhead. The psychological strain was immense. Every sunrise brought a new challenge, finding the perfect anchorage, refreshing the camouflage with local vegetation, maintaining absolute stillness and silence throughout the sweltering tropical day. The men could not move around the deck freely. Sudden movement might catch a pilot's eye. They could not cook hot meals or perform maintenance that might produce smoke or noise. They simply waited, sweating in the tropical heat beneath their canopy of leaves, listening for the drone of approaching aircraft, knowing that discovery meant death. Each evening, as shadows lengthened across the water, the same ritual repeated. The camouflage was inspected, the boilers were carefully brought up to pressure, and when full darkness had settled over the sea, the Abraham Crijnssen once again came alive and continued her desperate journey. On the morning of March 8th, Van Miert's wisdom in separating from his sister ships was proven in the most terrible way possible. The Jan van Amstel and Ellen Dubois had also attempted to escape, but neither ship had implemented the kind of comprehensive camouflage that Van Miert demanded. On March 7th, the Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had spotted both vessels at anchor near Gili Raja. Van Miert, who had encountered the two ships there, had immediately ordered the Abraham Crijnssen to relocate to Gili Genteng precisely because he did not want to be near vessels that lacked proper concealment. The consequences of inadequate camouflage became clear on the night of March 8th. The Elan Dubois, her defective boilers making escape impossible, was scuttled by her own crew. Her men transferred to the Jan van Amstel, which then attempted to break through to the Indian Ocean. Shortly before midnight, the Japanese destroyer Audacious found her. The Jan van Amstel never had a chance. The Audacious opened fire with her main batteries, and within minutes the Dutch minesweeper was sinking. 23 men died in the attack, including the commanding officer of the Elan Dubois, who had transferred to the ship only hours earlier. The survivors, those who were not killed by the continuing Japanese gunfire even as their ship capsized, spent 43 hours drifting in the water before being captured. The Abraham Crijnssen, hidden among the islands and invisible beneath her jungle disguise, heard nothing of her sister ship's fate. But Van Miert knew the risks. Every hour, every mile brought the possibility of the same end. The journey continued for 8 days and nights. The ship threaded past the Kangian Islands, where the crew once again went ashore to refresh their camouflage with vegetation that would match the local species. They navigated around coral reefs and through narrow channels, always calculating fuel consumption against remaining distance. The Abraham Crijnssen carried only 110 tons of fuel oil, enough for the journey if they were careful, but with no margin for error. On the evening of March 9th, the ship faced perhaps her most dangerous passage, the Allah Strait, the narrow channel between Lombok and Sumbawa that opened onto the Indian Ocean. Van Miert pushed the ship to 13.5 knots, her best safe speed, and drove through the strait in darkness, every man aboard knowing that Japanese patrols frequented these waters. They emerged into the open ocean without incident. The immediate danger had passed, but safety remained hundreds of miles away and the fuel gauges were dropping steadily. Van Miert ordered the camouflage discarded. In open water, the jungle disguise served no purpose and only slowed the ship. Overboard went the trees and branches that had saved their lives, the foliage that had transformed a warship into an island drifting back into the sea that had provided it. The Abraham Crijnssen, once again recognizable as herself, turned south toward Australia and reduced to an economical 10 knots to conserve what fuel remained. On Friday morning, March 13th, a lookout called out the sighting that every man aboard had been waiting for, land. The northwest cape of Australia had appeared on the horizon. They were not safe yet. Van Miert calculated his remaining fuel and made a decision that demonstrated the same careful judgment that had guided the entire escape. He bypassed Shark Bay and Dirk Hartog Island, knowing that stopping would consume precious fuel that might be needed if they encountered any final obstacle. The Abraham Crijnssen pressed on along the Australian coast. On March 15th at approximately noon, the Abraham Crijnssen dropped anchor at Geraldton, Western Australia. The exhausted crew, Men who had spent 8 days hiding in plain sight, sleeping in snatches, living on cold rations, and facing death with every sunrise, could finally rest. 5 days later, on March 20th, the ship arrived at Fremantle. She was the last Allied vessel to escape from Java and the only ship of her class in the entire region to survive. Back in the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese conquest was complete. On March 8th, the Dutch commander had broadcast the surrender announcement. More than 82,000 Allied soldiers and sailors became prisoners of war. The strategic resources of the Indies, the oil fields, the rubber plantations, the tin mines, fell into Japanese hands. It would be 3.5 years before Allied forces returned. Of the 4 minesweepers that had comprised the 2nd Division, 3 were gone. The Pieter de Bitter had been scuttled, the Elan du Bois had been scuttled, the Jan van Amstel had been sent to the bottom by Japanese gunfire. Only the Abraham Crijnssen remained, the ship that had become an island. Lieutenant Commander Van Miert and 9 of his crew were awarded the Cross of Merit for their courage during the escape. Van Miert continued to serve with distinction throughout the war, eventually commanding the gunboat Swemba after her captain was killed in action, and later the modern mine layer Willem van der Zaan. He retired with the rank of commander in 1967. The Abraham Crijnssen herself had a long career still ahead. In September 1942, she was commissioned into the Royal Australian Navy as HMAS Abraham Crijnssen, serving as an anti-submarine escort and submarine tender. Her crew became a remarkable mixture of Dutch sailors, Royal Navy survivors from the lost destroyer Jupiter, and Australian personnel. The wardroom developed its own diplomatic solution to the question of whose monarch's portrait should hang on the bulkhead. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands remained in her place of honor, while King George VI was installed in the captain's cabin. The ship served until 1960, when she was finally removed from the Naval Registry. For years afterward, she served as a training vessel for Dutch sea cadets, passed from Rotterdam to The Hague and back again, a quiet retirement for a vessel with an extraordinary history. Today, the Abraham Crijnssen rests at the Marine Museum in Den Helder, the Netherlands, restored to her wartime configuration. Visitors can walk her decks and stand on the bridge where Lieutenant Commander Van Miert made his decision to attempt the impossible. During summer months, the museum presents a theatrical performance called An Island Escapes, bringing to life those 8 days when a small steel minesweeper vanished into the landscape and fooled an empire. The photographs from 1942 still exist, preserved in the Australian War Memorial and the Dutch Institute for Military History. They show a vessel almost unrecognizable beneath her covering of tropical vegetation, the bridge buried under layers of palm fronds, the deck invisible beneath a jungle canopy, the hull painted to resemble stone. Looking at these images, it seems incredible that the disguise could have worked. But in the chaos of those desperate days, amid the 18,000 islands of the Indonesian archipelago, one more small patch of green apparently attracted no notice at all. The story of the Abraham Crijnssen endures because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature, the refusal to accept defeat, the willingness to attempt the impossible when all conventional options have failed. In the darkest days of the Pacific War, when the great warships of 4 nations had been swept from the seas and an entire region was falling to conquest, a small Dutch minesweeper and her volunteer crew found a way to survive. They did not fight their way out. They did not outrun their enemies. They simply became invisible, transforming themselves into part of the landscape, trusting that patience and ingenuity could succeed where firepower had failed. It remains to this day the only instance in naval history of a warship successfully escaping enemy forces by disguising itself as a tropical island. And somewhere in the waters of the Java Sea, 18,000 islands still dot the surface, silent witnesses to 8 days in March 1942, when one of their number was not quite what it appeared to be.